The offices of a PR firm in Washington, D.C. These shelves are full of documents that the public has never seen. They concern public relations work on behalf of the Bosnian government when Bosnia was at war with Serbia. They include various progress reports exchanged with the Bosnian government and materials intended for top politicians and the mass media. Normally, one would never expect to see such documents because they cover in detail the information war that a U.S. company conducted behind the scenes during ethnic strife in Europe. In 1992, conflict broke out between Serbs and Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Yugoslavia, with its predominantly Serbian population, intervened in the conflict and began to persecute Bosnian Muslims, a practice that came to be known as ethnic cleansing. Under contract to Muslim-governed Bosnia, the PR firm Ruder Finn began to isolate Yugoslavia by working on the mass media and politicians. And the key phrase in Ruder Finn's strategy was ethnic cleansing.
The Western governments are busy doing other things, and the Western governments had held the sway in the United Nations and other international fora. So we had to make an important case out of it.
The idea of what was happening was not new, but that became a catchphrase.
This man saw the phrase ethnic cleansing as a lethal weapon in an information war. In this program, we find out how that weapon was used.
And it's essential in this media mix that exists today, even more so than 8 years ago, that professionals be prepared to help both sides, all sides.
Early in April 1992, a leading Bosnian official arrived unaccompanied in the United States. The newly appointed foreign minister was on an important mission. Bosnia would soon be featured prominently in the international news, but at that time, Bosnia was not well known in the United States. The foreign minister couldn't expect anybody to meet him at the airport, so he hailed a taxi and rode into town on his own. His name, Dr. Haris Silajdzic. He had come to seek U.S. government support in dealing with a tragic situation unfolding in Bosnia. A few days before his arrival, a group of Serbs suddenly opened fire on a large crowd in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. 6 people died. Ethnic conflict then erupted between Serbs, who opposed the independence of Bosnia, and Bosnian Muslims, who were playing a central role in the independence movement.
We do not have an A-bomb. We are not rich. We do not have gold or oil. We are not numerous in population. So we are in no way a significant country that would attract attention automatically. There were no Western interests here.
How many messages do I have?
The foreign minister went first to U.S. human rights activist David Phillips, who had been protesting against the Serb actions.
I got a phone call from Haris Silajdzic, who was visiting Washington, D.C. I asked him where he was, and he told me he was in a phone booth. They had no embassy, so I suggested that he come over to my office, and he could use my facilities as their Bosnian embassy in Washington.
The U.S. government had recognized Bosnia's independence shortly before the arrival of Silajdzic. The foreign minister visited then Secretary of State James Baker and appealed to the U.S. government to take action. In his memoirs, Baker describes what happened during their meeting. He gave Silajdzic some advice. Baker emphasized the importance of using Western mass media to build support in Europe and North America. Without that support, the United States would be unable to take action.
It would be suicidal politically, nor could a president, to be quite honest, really just unilaterally do it, not to have the support of the American people, no matter how horrendous on a humanitarian side and a moral side and an ethical side the situation is.
What did I know? I mean, it was a completely new situation for me, not only U.S. media, but media in general. I never thought I would do this job. It never occurred to me that I would do this job. I was as far away from that as anybody else.
Reuter Finn is among the largest of America's 6,000 or so public relations firms. At the time of the Bosnian conflict, Reuter Finn was at the heart of the Bosnian government's information strategy.
Because they're driving these personnel carriers.
And overseeing the firm's Washington operations was James Harf.
I've never seen anything like that. I mean, you were literally doing...
David Phillips, the human rights activist visited by Silajdzic, decided that they needed the help of a professional media strategist. Harf was the man he recommended.
It was telling the message, marketing the message of what was happening to the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina under the brutal attacks and oppression and aggression of the Milosevic regime. That was the message.
These are records of developments when Reuter Finn was under contract to the Bosnian government. A note is made of Harf's first meeting with Silajdzic. The date, May 18th, 1 month after the foreign minister's arrival in the U.S. A decision was made to hold a news conference the very next day. Faxes were sent out immediately to various news organizations. To catch the attention of journalists, the PR firm said that the foreign minister of Bosnia-Herzegovina had come for the purpose of providing an update on the destruction of Sarajevo. And it was noted that Silajdzic spoke English fluently.
Mr. Gali said that they are meeting today again to discuss.
The news conference was held at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. But 2/3 of the seats were empty. Making the media interested in Bosnia was going to be an uphill battle.
And at that point, we needed to have a map of the region to show exactly where Bosnia was. Most Americans had no idea, including members of Congress. They may have recalled 1984, the Olympics. But Sarajevo, where was Sarajevo? In Yugoslavia, where is Yugoslavia?
The Bosnian presidential office in the capital, Sarajevo. Sarajevo was surrounded by Serbian forces and continually under attack. The presidential office itself was often hit. Shortly after Foreign Minister Silajdzic signed the contract with Reuter Finn, the office began receiving very disturbing reports.
Radioamateri pritekli u pomoć i improvizirali su jednu mrežu koja je bila od velike pomoći i njima, ali i nama koji smo tražili informacije iz krajeva u kojima nismo mogli biti direktno.
The ham radio operators told the presidential office that Serbs were persecuting Muslims. Serbs were attacking villages, singling out Muslims and either killing them or forcing them to leave their homes. The Serbs were rapidly creating a territory populated by only one group, fellow Serbs. Vast numbers of Muslims were turned into refugees. But Harf could also see this humanitarian crisis as a powerful public relations weapon.
From a realistic standpoint, if oil is involved, as in Kuwait, or other economic interests of the United States, it is less difficult to communicate the interest, the self-interest. We were appealing, and he was appealing in a different way, to a different level, to a more noble level in American society that is concerned that people have basic human rights and freedoms, and there's no question. Our nation was founded on that.
Harf's team needed to make a quick decision. How should they describe the actions of the Serbs? It was tempting to say Holocaust, but Harf was against that idea.
What was happening in the Balkans was despicable. It was horrible. But what happened during World War II, in terms of the magnitude, was even worse. And in our minds, the word Holocaust described what happened in World War II. And therefore, we had to, we felt, develop other ways of expressing the disdain for what was happening here.
This document, recording events in the spring of 1992, reveals the phrase that Harf selected: ethnic cleansing. This expression came to be used frequently in information passed to policymakers in Washington and the mass media. In the Second World War, a phrase equivalent to ethnic cleansing was used by the Nazi puppet regime in Croatia with regard to Serbs. The same phrase was also used by Serbs when invading Croatia. But in both cases, the meaning was the same. Get rid of ethnic groups who are different from us. In the early stages of Ruder Finn's involvement, ethnic purification was also used, but Harf decided that they should use ethnic cleansing only. Silajdzic wasn't happy with either phrase, but finally he agreed to go along with Harf's idea.
Well, this has become a term within the terminology of the situation. It is actually a genocide. So the ethnic cleansing is euphemism for genocide. We all know that. But then the Western governments in general, and some media were rather cautious using that word, because genocide means, by Geneva Convention, that any Western government that recognizes a genocide there must act.
In other words, instead of saying, well, now, such and such a village was attacked by the JNA, they came in, they gave an hour's notice to the people to move out, they had to pack up all their belongings, and then they were put on a bus or on a truck, and then they went to ethnic cleansing. That is what was happening.
Harf continued to fax out press releases on ethnic cleansing day after day. He also set up interviews with Silajdzic for journalists at highly influential newspapers, people who otherwise might not have written about him.
Had it not been that somebody from that PR firm called me and said he was coming to town, and did I know him, and would I like to meet him, and I went to see him, and possibly I would not have. I think after that, so I mean, I'm perfectly willing to admit that someone drew it to my attention.
Crozet herself introduced the phrase ethnic cleansing in an article and conveyed its cruel reality to readers. But she wasn't alone. It became a favorite phrase for many journalists.
We think of cleaning, there's a positive, let's say, to be clean. There's a sense of cleansing, in a very common sense of washing clothes or getting rid of dirt, to apply it, this expression, to cleaning the territory of a rival ethnic group, I mean, I think it has a powerful impact on us, certainly. Certainly in the West it does.
Harf continued to work on major U.S. newspapers. The top U.S. dailies frequently invite people in the news to speak with editorial writers. The information obtained appears in opinion pieces. Harf managed to get Foreign Minister Silajdzic invited to such editorial meetings to encourage America's top journalists to write about the conflict in Bosnia.
This is not an unusual technique, but to somebody from the Balkans 10 years ago, this was unusual or not understood. So, of course, part of our job is to brief Dr. Silajdzic on what he can expect.
In late May, Harf accompanied Foreign Minister Silajdzic to meetings at two major dailies. 1 week later, both papers published editorials expressing support for Bosnia. They quoted Silajdzic in their criticism of the Serbs.
We were more on the side of the Bosnians than we were the Serbs. We tilted very heavily the Bosnians because we felt they were the victims of Serb aggression.
Was PR information a factor? A Washington Post editor at that time acknowledges that press releases were handed out to journalists covering Bosnia. The journalists were asked to investigate the facts for themselves.
I mean, we would never write a story based on a press release from a paid public relations firm.
The next step was television. This too is mentioned in the documents that Harf retains. It is noted that since Silajdzic was telegenic, plans were made to use him as a spokesperson on television talk shows.
Good afternoon.
Harf took Silajdzic all over the world, setting up television appearances and news conferences.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Foreign Minister of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Dr. Haris Silajdzic, has a brief statement, and then we'll answer questions.
Silajdzic used the phrase ethnic cleansing wherever he went and condemned the Serbs.
Killing must stop. Deportation of civilians, a so-called ethnic cleansing, must stop.
Among Harf's major objectives was an appearance by Silajdzic on American ABC television's Nightline, a program closely followed by policymakers. The records show that Harf considered the program extremely important for reaching American decision makers.
You actually go through a very quick, short course of dealing, especially with the electronic media. And I used whatever I could use to attract their attention, including all kinds of techniques. Sometimes not saying one word, in order to convey the silence of death in Bosnia. Sometimes I made pauses, sometimes I changed tones.
Silajdzic eventually did appear on Nightline and was interviewed for about 10 minutes.
Mr. Foreign Minister, let me begin with what I understand sounds like a very callous question, but why are American interests involved to such a degree that Western force should be used to stop the bloodshed?
Why?
Yes.
Because it's the right thing to do to help fellow humans in time of bad need, because America has the moral authority and the privilege to defend the principles of democracy and freedom, because this is not an ordinary confrontation, it is a monstrous massacre of innocent civilians, because enough is enough. That's why.
He spoke English well, which was very important from our perspective in dealing with the media in the United States and internationally. So he was able to formulate a soundbite, as we say, to state his views succinctly. And that was a great benefit in really a war of information.
By June, the U.S. State Department was taking aim at Yugoslavia and using the phrase ethnic cleansing.
I don't take PR firms all that seriously, I have to say. I think partly because we have a very good press, what a PR firm says is not likely to be accepted without real evidence on the ground. And in fact, there was real evidence on the ground in Bosnia. So the job of the PR firm was simply to make sure that people who were important knew what the evidence was. They didn't have to manufacture it.
It was so awful that we embraced it to describe what the Serbs were doing. And so we used it. The U.S. government used it in our own public statements, condemning the Serbs, ethnic cleansing.
The White House was still wary of intervening in the conflict in Bosnia.
We're not going to go into the fact of using U.S. troops. We're not the world's policemen. It's a very complicated situation.
Harf now focused on the White House. This letter, drafted by Harf, was sent to President Bush to mark U.S. Independence Day celebrations on July 4th. It was signed by the Bosnian president. The letter spoke of respect for the U.S. stance on freedom, justice, and democracy, words that strike an emotional chord with Americans. The reply by President Bush to the Bosnian president is also in Harf's records. The letter by President Bush says, "I condemn the vile policy of ethnic cleansing. And Bush expresses support for working to isolate Serbia." July 9th. 3 months had passed since the start of the conflict in Bosnia. During a meeting of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, Bosnian President Alija Izetbegović met with President Bush for the first time. Also present were U.S. Secretary of State Baker and Bosnian Foreign Minister Silajdzic, and participating as an advisor to the Bosnian government, James Harf.
President Bush, was moved by what he heard. I'm not sure James Baker was, because he's a consummate politician.
Bush was determined to have his say. In his speech on that day, he condemned the practice of ethnic cleansing.
We cannot fail to make this a top priority while the so-called ethnic cleansing of Muslims occurs in Bosnia, even as we meet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yugoslavia became increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. Now, the Serb leaders tried to fight back with their own plan for influencing U.S. public opinion. 5 days after the speech by President Bush, Serbian President and power broker Slobodan Milosevic had Milan Panic become Yugoslavia's new prime minister. James Harf's documents show that Ruder Finn was well aware of what Serbia was doing. The public relations war must be won by the Bosnians. Panic sent Information Minister Perisic to New York to employ a public relations firm, but there was a major obstacle: U.S. economic sanctions on Yugoslavia, imposed in addition to UN sanctions. The services of U.S. public relations firms were among the items banned.
And I spoke to two agencies, and it was failure. They told me that they asked American government authorities, and that they were not allowed to receive any penny of the Serbian origin. And I asked them whether is it possible to hire them through American companies, and I waited 2 days for such an answer, and they said no.
But the Serbs did not give up. An organization of Serbian Americans arranged for a lawyer to negotiate with PR firms. Their view was that if no money from Yugoslavia was involved, they were not breaking sanctions. Finally, they were able to sign a contract with a major PR firm in Washington, and the firm presented a plan of action.
She presented us with a proposal, described in quite a bit of detail all of the steps that they would take to help to present the Serbian point of view to the American people and the people in Western Europe. We were pleased, we were impressed, and I believe either before the end of the meeting or perhaps in a letter the next day, I sent her a retainer check of $50,000, which she accepted, and I thought, you know, the deal was done and we were going to proceed with their representation.
Sarajevo was still under siege. Then even more shocking news arrived. It seemed that the Serbs had built concentration camps for imprisoning and slaughtering Muslims. The camps, too, are covered in James Harf's records. This press release, prepared by Harf, was based on information from the Bosnian government. It was faxed out to a number of media organizations on July 28th. The press release notes that the Bosnian government had uncovered the existence of concentration camps in which over 95,000 Bosnians were imprisoned.
And this is just abhorrent to anybody who has any sense of moral outrage. So we felt that this information had to be communicated to. How could we help? How could we help get this information out?
5 days after Harf sent out the fax, the U.S. tabloid Newsday published an article about concentration camps. The article said that Serbs were torturing and executing Muslims. It was based on independent research, and the writer was subsequently awarded the Pulitzer Prize. Harf quoted the article in new faxes that he sent to the media and politicians.
That's the nature of the news business. You know, if you have something that's just grave and alarming and factual, it's a fact. You've simply put a fact out there that's already been there, but you've defined it in a way that people can use it and relate to it, and then it's no longer yours. It's everybody else's.
The spreading news of concentration camps dealt a fatal blow to the Serbs' own PR efforts. The PR company that had been hired suddenly withdrew its services. On August 26th, just over 4 months after the outbreak of the conflict in Bosnia, global attention focused on London, the setting for a peace conference. Organized by the EC and the United Nations, it was attended by the leaders of the Western world. The aim of the conference was to bring the warring parties together and resolve the conflict once and for all. On this occasion, Yugoslavian Prime Minister Panic managed to hire a PR consultant in Geneva. But Serbia's media strategy was in disarray. President Milosevic refused to attend a press conference and adopted a confrontational attitude with the Western media. This itself was widely reported and further damaged Yugoslavia's image. Meanwhile, Harf was quietly arranging for a Muslim family who had been imprisoned in a Serbian concentration camp to appear at a news conference. At the end of a briefing by Foreign Minister Silajdzic, a Bosnian mother and her children, who had arrived in London as refugees, were called to the platform.
Ja mogu lično da pokažem, a izvinjavam se svima kao braći. Šta su mi radili? I have to apologize, but I have to show you the cards that they done to me.
The pictures were broadcast in Britain on the news that same evening.
Ovo ljudi ne bi uradili.
It was unplanned. It wasn't strategically designed, but obviously when we heard that this family was arriving, we said, well, this would be, let's bring them to this news conference, because again, it graphically illustrated the point.
The London conference succeeded in getting the Serbs to promise to withdraw all heavy weapons and close down every camp. But as soon as the conference ended, the Serbs stepped up their attacks with heavy weapons. The UN General Assembly was convened on September 15th. The United States and Britain began to press for Yugoslavia's expulsion from the General Assembly. And the State Department had already made up its mind.
The Serbian response to what we had done up until the time that the General Assembly met in New York in September of '92 had been essentially to continue its policies and to reject any pressures from the United States or from the European Union or anyone else to pull back and try to resolve the crisis. So in this sense, the expulsion of Serbia for failing to respond to the previous measures taken was the next step up the ladder.
James Harf was present at the General Assembly session as an official member of the Bosnian delegation. While observing proceedings, he was drafting the Bosnian president's first speech before the United Nations. This was a crucial strategic moment for Bosnia. It was also a showcase for Harf's expertise in public relations.
It wasn't a, shall we say, a well-oiled, smooth-running operation like Japan's government or our government. And this was very chaotic. So into that environment, we are now a part of this, trying to bring some order out of the chaos. And here is the United Nations General Assembly and a very important speech at a time when this issue is escalating on the world scene.
His Excellency Mr. Ali Izetbegovic.
Harf's draft of the speech included the phrases democracy, coexistence of multi-ethnic groups, and ethnic cleansing.
It's an offer of a nation born of ethnic coexistence rather than ethnic cleansing. Because we are an ethnically mixed, intermingled country. Government at every level will respect the equal rights of all of the peoples of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
But it conveyed to Americans a tolerance of diversity and a welcoming of different points of view. And that was very accurate from what I had learned, certainly in places like Sarajevo. So I think it was accurate to describe the situation that way and the population that way. It resonated with Americans as well.
A vote was taken the following day. Yugoslavia became the first country ever to be expelled from the General Assembly of the United Nations, and by an overwhelming margin.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 127. Against, 6.
There's a saying in Bosnia that says that a baby does not get milk from the mother unless it cries. So we had to be heard. And the Western governments are busy doing other things, and the Western governments had held the sway in the United Nations and other international fora. So we had to make an important case out of it. And without media, it was impossible.